You know, I've spent decades watching how Washington operates, and I'll tell you something that ought to concern every person counting on their monthly check. While politicians argue over budget numbers and debt ceilings, millions of Americans are sitting at home wondering if their February payment will actually arrive on time. Let me be direct with you. The Social Security Administration is processing payments for over 70 million beneficiaries right now, and we're heading into a month where congressional gridlock could create real problems. I'm not talking about theoretical political theater. I'm talking about the actual mechanics of how your money moves from the Treasury to your bank account. Here's what most people don't understand. Social Security isn't just some government handout that politicians can turn on and off like a faucet. You paid into this system your entire working life. Those FICA taxes that came out of every single paycheck, that was your money, invested in a promise. But that promise depends on something very specific, the government's ability to process payments. And right now, we're watching a situation unfold that could affect when and how those payments get delivered. The numbers tell a story that should make anyone paying attention sit up straight. The Treasury Department processes approximately $6 billion in Social Security payments every single day this country operates. Think about that magnitude for a moment. $6 billion moving through electronic systems, reaching bank accounts from Maine to California, ensuring that people who work their entire lives can pay their rent, buy their groceries, and keep their lights on. Now, I've always believed in understanding the machinery behind the curtain, and right now, that machinery is running while Congress debates whether to keep it fully funded. This isn't some abstract economic discussion you can afford to ignore. This is about the check you're expecting to see in your account next month. Let me walk you through exactly what's happening right now in Washington, because the news coverage you're seeing on television is frankly doing a terrible job of explaining the actual mechanics. The Social Security Administration operates on what they call a payment schedule, and it's been remarkably consistent for decades. If you were born between the 1st and the 10th of the month, your payment comes on the second Wednesday. Born between the 11th and 20th, third Wednesday. 21st through the end of the month, fourth Wednesday. SSI recipients get their payments on the 1st of every month, and if that falls on a weekend or holiday, it comes the business day before. This system has worked like clockwork because it's designed to spread the processing load across the month. But here's where it gets interesting, and by interesting, I mean concerning. The continuing resolution that's currently funding the government includes full funding for Social Security payment processing, but we're watching a political standoff that could affect the administrative functions of the Social Security Administration itself. Now, Social Security benefits are considered mandatory spending, which means they're supposed to continue even during a government shutdown. The checks are supposed to keep flowing. And this is a critical distinction that most news outlets are completely missing. The people who process those checks, the people who answer the phones when you call with a question, the people who handle appeals and new applications, those are federal employees who could be affected by budget disputes. I've seen this pattern before, and it never ends well for the people who can least afford disruption. During previous government shutdowns, Social Security payments continued, yes, but the service infrastructure ground to a halt. You couldn't get anyone on the phone. New applications sat in limbo. Disability appeals that were already taking 18 months suddenly took 24 months. The money kept flowing for existing beneficiaries, but the entire support system that makes Social Security function as a program essentially froze. And we're potentially heading into another one of these situations while lawmakers grandstand about spending levels that frankly have nothing to do with Social Security's actual financial structure. Here's something that ought to make you think about the fundamental dishonesty of current political discourse around Social Security. The program has its own dedicated funding source. Your FICA taxes go into the Social Security Trust Fund. That's separate money. It's not part of the general budget in the way that defense spending or education funding is part of the general budget. So when politicians talk about cutting Social Security to reduce the deficit, they're either economically illiterate or they're being deliberately deceptive. Social Security doesn't contribute to the federal deficit. In fact, for decades, Social Security ran surpluses that the government borrowed against to fund other programs. The federal government owes Social Security money, not the other way around. Now let's talk about what's actually happening with your payments for February, because that's what you came here to understand. The payment schedule for February is already locked in at the Social Security Administration. If you're receiving retirement benefits and you were born between the 1st and 10th, your payment date is February 12th. Born between the 11th and 20th, February 19th. Born between the 21st and 31st, February 26th. SSI recipients should see their payment on January 31st because February 1st falls on a Saturday. These dates are set, programmed into the system, and barring some catastrophic breakdown in government function, these payments will process. But here's where you need to pay attention to the details, because the devil is always in the details. While your regular monthly payment should arrive on schedule, there are several things happening right now that could affect the amount you receive or any additional benefits you might be expecting. The cost of living adjustment that took effect in January is already factored into your payment amount. For most beneficiaries, that was a 2.5% increase. Now that might sound reasonable until you actually look at what inflation has done to the things seniors actually buy. Medical costs are up significantly more than 2.5%. Housing costs for those who rent are up more than 2.5% in most markets. The formula they use to calculate cost of living adjustments is based on the Consumer Price Index for urban wage earners, which frankly doesn't reflect the spending patterns of people who are 75 years old and managing chronic health conditions. I want to spend a moment on something that's getting almost no coverage but matters enormously if you're receiving both Social Security and SSI. There's a provision called the Social Security Benefit Offset that affects how much SSI you can receive if you also get Social Security retirement or disability. The way this works is mathematically straightforward but practically complicated. SSI is designed to bring people up to a minimum income level, currently $714 per month for an individual. If you're receiving Social Security benefits, those benefits count as income when calculating your SSI eligibility. So if your Social Security check is $500, your SSI payment would theoretically be $214 to bring you up to that minimum. But there are exclusions and deductions that affect this calculation, and the Social Security Administration has been making errors in how they apply these calculations at a rate that should alarm anyone who cares about competent government administration. The Office of Inspector General released a report last year showing that the Social Security Administration had made overpayments and underpayments affecting hundreds of thousands of beneficiaries, and they're now going back and trying to correct these errors. If you're one of the people who was overpaid, you might be facing a demand to repay money you already spent in good faith, believing it was yours. If you were underpaid, you might eventually get back payments, but the process for claiming those back payments is bureaucratic and slow. This is happening right now while Congress is playing games with government funding, and the people who could help you navigate this situation are the same Social Security Administration employees who might be furloughed or working without pay during a shutdown. Let me tell you about the disability side of this equation, because if you're receiving SSDI or waiting for a disability determination, you're in an even more precarious position. The Social Security disability system is already overwhelmed. Before any budget drama, before any political standoff, the system was taking an average of almost 7 months just to make an initial determination on a disability claim. If you're denied and you file an appeal, you're looking at potentially years before you get a hearing in front of an administrative law judge. And here's the cruel mathematics of that delay. People who are genuinely disabled and unable to work are living those years without income, burning through whatever savings they had, often losing their housing, sometimes losing their families, all while waiting for a bureaucracy to acknowledge what their doctors have already confirmed. During previous government disruptions, the backlog of disability cases grew worse. Hearings were canceled, decisions were delayed, and while the politicians eventually worked out their differences and the government reopened, those lost months never came back for the people who were waiting. If you're currently in the disability determination process, you need to understand that any government shutdown or extended budget fight could push your timeline out even further. The law says Social Security has to make a decision within a certain time frame, but there's essentially no enforcement mechanism when they miss those deadlines. You can't sue them for being slow. You just have to wait. Now, I want to address something I'm seeing in the political rhetoric that bothers me tremendously because it's built on a foundation of dishonesty. There are lawmakers currently suggesting that Social Security needs to be reformed by raising the retirement age or means testing benefits to make the program sustainable. Let me be very clear about what's actually happening with Social Security's finances. The trust fund is projected to be depleted around 2034 or 2035, depending on whose projections you trust. When people hear that, they panic, thinking Social Security will disappear. That's not what happens. What happens is that Social Security would only be able to pay out what it takes in from current FICA taxes, which would be roughly 77 to 80% of scheduled benefits. That's a real problem and it needs to be addressed, but it's not the apocalyptic scenario it's often portrayed as. The solution to this funding gap is mathematically straightforward. You could raise the payroll tax cap, which currently cuts off at $160,000. Someone making $1 million a year pays the same amount into Social Security as someone making $160,000 because income above that cap isn't subject to FICA taxes. Eliminate that cap or even just raise it significantly and you solve most of the funding gap. Alternatively, you could raise the FICA tax rate by a small amount, spread across both employees and employers. These aren't pleasant solutions, but they're honest solutions that maintain the fundamental promise of Social Security. Raising the retirement age, on the other hand, is a benefit cut dressed up as reform. If you worked construction for 40 years and your body is broken down by 65, telling you that you need to work until 69 to get full benefits isn't reform, it's a broken promise. Here's what's particularly galling about the current political moment. The same lawmakers who are expressing such concern about Social Security's long-term sustainability had no problem passing tax cuts that added trillions to the federal debt. They had no problem with defense budgets that exceed what the Pentagon actually requests. But when it comes to ensuring that people who paid into a system their entire working lives get what they were promised, suddenly we need to have serious conversations about sustainability and tough choices. It's dishonest, and anyone paying attention can see through it. Let me bring this back to your practical situation for February and the months ahead. Your payment should arrive on schedule. The dates I mentioned earlier are locked in, but you need to be prepared for the possibility that if you need to contact Social Security for any reason, you might not be able to reach anyone. The phone lines are already overwhelmed under normal circumstances. During any kind of government disruption, they become essentially useless. If you have a problem with your payment, if you need to report a change in circumstances, if you have questions about your benefits, you need to try to handle those things now before any potential shutdown or extended budget fight makes the system even less accessible. If you're receiving paper checks rather than direct deposit, and there are still a few million people who are, you need to understand that any mail delays compound during government disruptions. The checks still get sent, but the processing and delivery can slow down. If you haven't already switched to direct deposit, now would be an excellent time to do that. You can set it up online through the Social Security website, or you can call and request the change, though as I mentioned, getting through on the phone might be challenging. For those of you managing on SSI, which is the program for people with very limited income and resources, you're in the most vulnerable position. SSI recipients are, by definition, people living very close to the financial edge. Any disruption, any delay, any error in payment processing can be catastrophic. If your SSI payment doesn't arrive on January 31st as scheduled, you might not have the resources to wait a few days for the problem to be sorted out. You need to have a plan. Talk to your landlord now about what happens if there's a payment delay. Talk to your utility companies. Build whatever small cushion you can, even if it's just $20 or $30 to give yourself a buffer. The broader point I'm trying to make here is about the fundamental relationship between citizens and their government. Social Security isn't a handout. It isn't welfare in the sense that word is commonly used politically. It's a contract. You paid in with the promise that the system would be there when you needed it. The fact that we're even having conversations about whether those payments might be disrupted because of political gamesmanship shows how far we've drifted from any reasonable standard of government competence and responsibility. The people making these decisions, the lawmakers playing games with government funding, they're not going to miss any meals if Social Security payments are delayed. They're not going to lose their housing. They're not going to have to choose between medication and food. But millions of Americans who did everything right, who worked hard, who paid their taxes, who played by the rules, they might face exactly those choices because of political dysfunction. I've always believed that you understand a society by how it treats its most vulnerable members and how it honors its commitments to people who built the prosperity everyone else enjoys. Right now, we're failing that test. Your February payment will probably arrive on time. The system will probably keep functioning despite the political chaos, but probably isn't good enough when we're talking about people's ability to survive. And the fact that we're in a position where probably is the best assurance I can offer tells you everything you need to know about the state of governance in this country.